Altitude drops, oxygen masks rattle softly in their overhead compartments, and the glowing "Fasten Seatbelt" sign illuminates a cabin paralyzed by sudden, suffocating tension. What began as a routine luxury flight shattered the moment a powerful woman in first class decided a quietly laughing black family was a federal security threat. She flashed a government badge, demanded an immediate emergency diversion, and smugly thought her high-ranking authority made her completely untouchable. She was catastrophically wrong. Prepare for a shocking, true-to-life story of weaponized privilege, a sudden descent, and a stunning twist that cost a corrupt official everything. Boarding passes crinkled in the anxious hands of weary travelers at Chicago O'Hare's Gate K-12. Rain battered the thick, reinforced glass of the terminal windows, blurring the neon lights of the tarmac vehicles into streaks of watery yellow and red. Flight 882 to Honolulu was already delayed by 45 minutes, and the stagnant air in the boarding area was thick with the distinct heavy agitation of 300 people who just wanted to be in the sky. Arthur Hayes, a senior partner at a prestigious Chicago architectural firm, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blazer. He was a man who carried himself with the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who had spent his entire life overperforming to prove he belonged in rooms exactly like this one. Beside him stood his wife, Anastasia, a brilliant pediatric surgeon, whose usual exhausted demeanor had been entirely replaced by a radiant, vacation-ready glow. Clinging to Anastasia's hand was their 7-year-old daughter Maya, who was meticulously explaining the plot of her favorite animated movie to her 4-year-old brother Jackson. They were a picture-perfect family embarking on a deeply earned 2-week luxury vacation to Hawaii to celebrate Arthur's recent promotion. Across the terminal, isolated in the roped-off priority seating area, sat Margaret Hastings. Margaret sat rigid in her leather chair, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping a harsh, irregular rhythm against the polished plastic of her armrest. A federal magistrate judge with 22 years on the bench, Margaret was accustomed to a world that bent entirely to her gavel. She wore a pristine, cream-colored cashmere turtleneck that looked wholly impractical for a long-haul flight, paired with a scowl that warned everyone in her immediate vicinity to keep their distance. She was flying to Honolulu for a high-profile judicial conference, and the weather delay had already soured her notoriously volatile mood. Kimberly, the overworked gate agent, nervously tapped her microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to begin boarding Flight 882 to Honolulu. We will begin with our first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members." Margaret immediately stood grabbing her designer leather tote bag, purposefully cutting off a young businessman to ensure she was the absolute first person scanning her ticket. She offered Kimberly a tight, humorless smile, entirely ignoring the agent's polite greeting, and marched down the jet bridge. She needed her pre-departure champagne, and she needed the world to be quiet. Boarding commenced smoothly for exactly 2 minutes. Margaret settled into seat 2A, a spacious window seat in the luxurious pod-style first-class cabin. She slipped off her loafers, placed her noise-cancelling headphones around her neck, and closed her eyes, savoring the exclusivity of the premium cabin. But her solitary peace was abruptly shattered by the sound of cheerful, tiny footsteps. Footsteps echoed softly on the carpeted aisle as the Hayes family made their way into the first-class cabin. Arthur led the way, carrying a sleek carry-on bag, checking the seat numbers. "All right, crew," Arthur said warmly, his voice kept to a polite indoor murmur. "We have row 3. Maya, you're with Mum in 3C and 3D. Jackson, you're with me, right here in 3A and 3B. Margaret's eyes snapped open. She turned her head slowly, her gaze raking over the Hayes family. Her expression instantly shifted from resting annoyance to overt, unconcealed disbelief. She watched as Arthur lifted their bags into the overhead compartment with practiced ease. She watched Anastasia gently help Jackson into his spacious leather seat, buckling him in while he quietly hummed a song. Margaret's posture stiffened. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the armrest, projecting her voice just loudly enough to ensure it breached the personal space of row 3. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her tone dripping with a honeyed condescension that masked a sharp edge. "The economy cabin is further back, through the curtain. I believe you people are blocking the aisle for the premium passengers." Arthur paused. He slowly lowered his arms from the overhead bin and turned to face Margaret. His expression remained entirely neutral, though Anastasia felt a familiar, exhausting knot tighten in her stomach. Arthur offered a polite, thoroughly professional smile. "Good morning to you too, ma'am. We are exactly where we are supposed to be. Seats 3A through 3D. Have a wonderful flight?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She visibly recoiled, her face flushing with an ugly mix of embarrassment and indignant fury. She muttered something under her breath, a string of indistinct syllables that ended with the distinct, sharp hiss of the word ridiculous. She aggressively snapped her seatbelt together and aggressively turned her body toward the window, her back acting as a wall of hostility against the aisle. Jackson, completely oblivious to the venom radiating from the seat in front of him, giggled as Anastasia handed him a small, plush sea turtle. "Look, Daddy, he's ready to swim," Jackson whispered excitedly. Arthur smiled warmly, patting his son's head. "He sure is, buddy. Just keep your voice down, okay? We're sharing this space with other people." Arthur's eyes flicked briefly to the back of Margaret's head. He knew exactly what was happening. He had spent 40 years navigating the treacherous waters of corporate America as a black man. He could spot a Margaret Hastings from a mile away. She wasn't just annoyed by children. She was deeply, fundamentally offended by their presence in a space she genuinely believed belonged exclusively to her. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering warm towels and pre-departure beverages. Chloe, a cheerful junior flight attendant with a bright smile, offered Arthur a glass of orange juice. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hayes. We're so glad to have you and your beautiful family flying with us today." Margaret practically snatched her glass of champagne from Chloe's tray. "Just ensure we actually take off today," Margaret snapped, "and ensure the cabin remains peaceful. I have highly sensitive legal briefs to review, and I simply cannot tolerate distractions from anyone." She shot a venomous glare through the small gap between her seat and the window, aiming it squarely at Anastasia. Anastasia took a slow, deep breath, reaching across the aisle to gently squeeze Arthur's hand. Arthur squeezed back a silent communication forged through years of shared resilience. They would not let this bitter woman ruin their hard-earned celebration, but as the heavy cabin doors finally closed with a thick, pressurized thud, sealing them inside the metal tube, Arthur couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in seat 2A. Engines roared to life with a bone-rattling intensity, pushing the massive Boeing 757 down the runway before it gracefully lifted into the dark, rain-swept Chicago sky. The turbulence was rough for the first 20 minutes, shaking the cabin and forcing everyone into a tense silence. But as the aircraft finally punched through the heavy cloud cover and leveled out at 35,000 feet, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, and the collective anxiety of the cabin began to dissipate. Sunlight flooded through the windows, bathing the first-class section in a warm, golden hue. Cruising altitude usually meant relaxation, but for Margaret Hastings, it was an opportunity to go on the offensive. She aggressively pulled her tray table out, slamming her laptop down with enough force to make the passenger across the aisle flinch. She began typing furiously, but her attention was clearly entirely focused on the row behind her. Anastasia reached into a carefully packed carry-on bag and pulled out Jackson's iPad. She had specifically downloaded a dozen educational cartoons to keep him occupied for the grueling 8-hour journey. She plugged in his child-sized volume-limiting headphones and placed them gently over his ears. "There you go, sweetie. Watch your show." Jackson sat perfectly still, his eyes glued to the screen, occasionally letting out a soft, muffled giggle when a cartoon dog did a flip. The sound was practically imperceptible, entirely drowned out by the ambient roar of the jet engines and the humming of the climate control system. Margaret suddenly slammed her laptop shut. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet cabin. She dramatically ripped her noise-cancelling headphones off her neck, letting out an exaggerated theatrical sigh that sounded like a deflating tire. She forcefully pressed the overhead flight attendant call button. A soft ding resonated through the cabin. Chloe, the junior flight attendant, hurried over her professional smile firmly in place. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" Margaret didn't look at Chloe. Instead, she turned her head sideways, projecting her voice toward row 3. "Yes, you absolutely can. You can tell the passengers behind me to control their unruly children. This is a first-class cabin, not a public playground. The noise is absolutely blaring and completely intolerable." Chloe blinked, thoroughly confused. She looked past Margaret to the Hayes family. Maya was quietly reading a chapter book, completely engrossed. Jackson was wearing headphones, silently watching his iPad, his little feet swinging gently, not even touching the seat in front of him. Arthur and Anastasia were quietly drinking coffee. The family was the literal definition of perfect passengers. Approaching row 3, awkwardly, Chloe leaned in and whispered to Arthur, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry to even ask this, but the passenger in front of you is complaining about noise." "Is there any chance the iPad volume is leaking?" Arthur furrowed his brow, completely bewildered. He reached over and lifted one side of Jackson's headphones. Silence. "No, Chloe," Arthur replied smoothly, his voice steady and calm. "He has noise-limiting headphones on. There is no sound. As you can see, my son is sitting quietly." Retreating to the galley, Chloe awkwardly relayed the message to Margaret. "Ma'am, the child is wearing headphones. There really isn't any noise coming from their row. Perhaps it's the engine hum you're hearing." Margaret's face contorted into a mask of pure outrage. "Are you calling me a liar?" She hissed, her voice, now rising well above a conversational volume, drawing the attention of several other passengers in the cabin. "I know what I hear. It is a constant, irritating disruption. But of course, in today's society, we just allow anyone to buy their way into spaces they don't belong in, bringing their ghetto behavior with them. Nobody has any respect for civility anymore." Tension thickened the air instantly. The word hung in the cabin like a foul odor. Ghetto. It was a deliberate, calculated strike, a deeply offensive dog whistle intended to provoke. Anastasia's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as a fierce, protective, maternal instinct flared to life. She opened her mouth to speak, but Arthur gently placed his hand on her arm, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. He knew the trap Margaret was setting. If Anastasia raised her voice, if she showed anger, Margaret would instantly weaponize it, playing the victim. Arthur refused to give her that satisfaction. Unbuckling his seatbelt, slowly, deliberately, Arthur stood up. He smoothed his tie, towering over the divider, projecting an aura of absolute, unbothered professionalism. He looked directly down at Margaret, who was stubbornly staring at her dark laptop screen. "Excuse me, Mom," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a rich, resonant baritone that commanded immediate attention. The entire first-class cabin went silent, straining to listen. "If there is a genuine issue you are experiencing, I would appreciate it if you addressed me directly as an adult, rather than whispering racially coded insults to the flight crew. My children are quiet. We are quiet. If our mere presence is upsetting to you, I suggest you put your headphones back on and turn around. Panic entirely manufactured and deeply malicious flashed across Margaret's face. She didn't respond to his logic. She didn't apologize. Instead, she leaned back hard into her seat, physically recoiling as if Arthur had just drawn a weapon. She threw her hands up, knocking her empty champagne glass onto the floor, where it shattered into dozens of crystalline pieces. "Don't you dare threaten me!" Margaret shrieked, her voice suddenly echoing with a theatrical, piercing terror. "Get away from me, flight attendant. Help, this man is threatening me. I am being threatened." Arthur simply stood there, his hands resting casually on his hips, a look of profound disbelief washing over his face. He hadn't moved an inch toward her. He hadn't raised his voice, but as the frantic footsteps of the senior flight crew rushed down the aisle toward them, Arthur realized with a sinking dread that the truth of what just happened no longer mattered. Margaret had pressed the emergency button of white female distress, and the entire system was about to rush to her defense. Gregory, the senior purser, sprinted through the curtain, separating the galley from the cabin, his polished black shoes sliding slightly on the carpet. He was a veteran of the skies, a man with 25 years of flight experience, who had dealt with everything from medical emergencies to drunken brawls. But as he arrived at row 2, the scene before him was entirely perplexing. Margaret was hyperventilating, clutching the collar of her cashmere sweater, her eyes wide with feigned horror. Arthur, conversely, was calmly sitting back down in his seat, rebuckling his belt, calmly rubbing his temples. "What is going on here?" Gregory demanded, his authoritative voice instantly lowering the temperature in the cabin by a fraction. "Everyone remain in your seats. Ma'am, are you injured?" Margaret pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. "That man just stood over me in a highly aggressive manner. He verbally assaulted me. He threatened my safety, and his children are completely out of control. I demand they be moved to the back of the plane immediately. I do not feel safe in this cabin." Passengers in surrounding rows began exchanging bewildered glances. A young software developer sitting in seat 4A, a man named Thomas, leaned forward. "That's completely untrue," Thomas said loudly. "The guy just asked her to stop insulting his family. She's making a scene over nothing. The kids haven't made a peep." Margaret shot Thomas a look of pure venom. "Mind your own business, young man, before you find yourself implicated in this." She turned back to Gregory, her voice trembling with synthetic rage. "I want them removed from this cabin. Now. They are a security risk. His aggression is a clear indicator of a hostile threat." Anastasia pulled Maya and Jackson close to her, wrapping her arms around them. Maya looked up, her large brown eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, did Daddy do something wrong? Why is that lady yelling?" "Daddy didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," Anastasia whispered fiercely, kissing her daughter's forehead while glaring daggers at the back of Margaret's head. "Some people are just deeply unhappy." Gregory took a deep breath, assessing the situation with an experienced eye. He saw the shattered glass from Margaret's own clumsy panic. He saw the terrified children. He saw Arthur's restrained, exhausted composure. Gregory made a judgment call. "Ma'am," Gregory said to Margaret, his tone firm but respectful, "I have heard the testimony of the surrounding passengers. Mr. Hayes has returned to his seat. There are no available seats in the main cabin, and even if there were, I am not relocating a family based on a verbal disagreement. I am asking you to calm down, refrain from interacting with row 3, and let us continue this flight peacefully. If you cannot do that, I will be forced to issue you a formal warning for disruptive behavior." Silence fell over the cabin. It was a stunning rebuke. Margaret's eyes widened, not in fear, but in an explosive, blinding fury. She had been denied. A lowly flight attendant had dared to contradict her, had dared to side with the people she deemed beneath her. The veins in her neck bulged. Reaching into her oversized leather tote bag with frantic, jerky movements, Margaret bypassed her makeup bag and her wallet. She pulled out a heavy, dark blue leather wallet. With a flick of her wrist, she flipped it open, holding it up directly in Gregory's face. The bright overhead cabin light caught the glint of a heavy gold federal badge positioned right next to a Department of Justice identification card. "My name is Margaret Hastings," she announced, her voice, now devoid of any panic, replaced instead by the cold, hard steel of absolute authority. "I am a federal magistrate judge for the United States government. Under federal aviation regulations and Title 49, Section 44902, I am officially declaring the passenger in seat 3A a Level 2 physical threat to my safety and the security of this flight." Gregory swallowed hard, his professional facade cracking just a fraction. He stepped back, his eyes darting from the gold badge to Margaret's unyielding, terrifyingly calm face. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, her voice echoing loudly in the completely silent cabin, "as a high-ranking federal official, under threat I am invoking emergency aviation protocols. I demand you contact the captain immediately. You will divert this aircraft to the nearest available tarmac, and you will have local law enforcement and federal marshals waiting to apprehend this man. If you refuse my directive, I will personally see to it that you are permanently grounded and charged with aiding a federal threat." Gregory felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. As a purser, he was trained to handle rowdy passengers, but the legal weight of a federal judge invoking a security protocol mid-flight was a nightmare scenario. Aviation law was incredibly complex regarding threats declared by federal officials. Even if he knew she was lying, failing to report a declared threat from a credentialed official could result in severe federal penalties, termination, and massive liability for the airline. His hands were legally tied. I will inform the captain of your declaration, Your Honor." Gregory stuttered slightly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He shot an agonizingly apologetic look toward Arthur and Anastasia before turning on his heel and marching briskly toward the reinforced cockpit door. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Mitchell was enjoying a remarkably smooth flight path over the Midwest. He was a military veteran, a man who preferred the predictable physics of aerodynamics to the unpredictable chaos of human beings. When the interphone chimed, he answered casually. "Go ahead, Gregory." Mitchell listened in stunned silence as Gregory rapidly explained the situation. A federal judge, a gold badge, a declared Level 2 threat against a minority passenger who, according to the crew, had done absolutely nothing wrong. "Captain, she's citing Title 49, Gregory whispered frantically into the phone. "She's demanding a diversion. I know the guy is innocent, I know it, but she has the badge. If we ignore a federal magistrate declaring a security threat, and something does happen, it's our licenses. It's the airline." Captain Mitchell gripped the yoke, his knuckles turning white. He hated the bureaucracy of the sky. He checked his navigation screens. They were currently flying over Nebraska. The nearest major airport equipped to handle a heavy 777 emergency landing was Omaha's Epley Airfield, barely 20 minutes away. "Copy that, Gregory," Mitchell said, his voice heavy with grim resignation. "Federal protocols dictate we take all declared threats from credentialed officials seriously until investigated on the ground. Secure the cabin. I'm calling air traffic control." Chimes echoed through the first-class cabin, followed immediately by the crackle of the public address system. Captain Mitchell's voice filled the aircraft, devoid of its usual cheerful warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck, due to a declared security situation in the cabin, we have been ordered to divert our flight. We are currently beginning our descent into Omaha, Nebraska. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. We will have law enforcement meeting the aircraft upon arrival." Arthur's blood ran cold. He looked out the window and watched in horror as the horizon tilted violently. The massive plane was banking hard to the left, the engine pitch drastically changing as they began a rapid, aggressive descent. Anastasia gripped Arthur's arm, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as Jackson began to cry from the sudden change in air pressure. Margaret Hastings leaned back in seat 2A, slowly closing her leather badge wallet. She picked up her noise-canceling headphones, a triumphant, malicious smirk playing across her lips. She had won. She had shown them exactly who held the power in this world. But as the aircraft plummeted toward the Nebraska tarmac, Margaret had no idea that Captain Mitchell had made a second, highly confidential call to air traffic control, a call that would ensure the police waiting on the runway weren't there for Arthur Hayes, but to investigate a federal official for the catastrophic federal crime of maliciously interfering with a flight crew. The descent had just begun, and Margaret's pristine world was about to crash and burn. Tires screeched with a violent smoking impact as the massive Boeing 737 slammed onto the runway at Omaha's Epley Airfield. The thrust reversers roared to life with deafening intensity, throwing passengers violently forward against their seatbelts as the aircraft aggressively decelerated. Outside the rain-streaked windows, the bleak gray Nebraska landscape blurred past, quickly replaced by a terrifying organized swarm of flashing red, blue, and amber lights. Arthur Hayes felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He watched as 3 armored police SUVs and 2 unmarked black sedans raced parallel to the braking aircraft, their sirens muted by the thick fuselage, but their intent unmistakable. He was a wealthy, highly educated professional, but in that claustrophobic cabin, staring at the approaching heavily armed tactical units, he knew exactly what society saw first. He reached across the armrest, gripping Anastasia's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Don't say a word when they board," Arthur whispered urgently to his terrified wife, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to maintain his stoic facade. "Keep your hands visible. Let me do the talking. Do not let them separate us from the kids." Maya was crying softly into Anastasia's shoulder, while Jackson, sensing the overwhelming anxiety radiating from his parents, had curled into a tight, silent ball in his seat. The systemic terror of the moment was suffocating. Directly in front of them, Margaret Hastings was practically glowing with vindictive anticipation. She casually flipped open her compact mirror, meticulously reapplying a coat of plum-colored lipstick as the plane taxied off the main runway and came to a sudden jarring halt on a remote stretch of tarmac. She smoothed her cashmere sweater, tucked her gold federal badge prominently into her breast pocket so it would be instantly visible to the responding officers, and waited for her engineered justice to be served. Heavy thuds echoed from the front of the aircraft as the ground crew hastily connected the mobile boarding stairs to the L1 door. A tense, suffocating silence fell over the first-class cabin. Nobody spoke. The rhythmic mechanical hum of the auxiliary power unit was the only sound. The heavy, reinforced cabin door swung open with a sharp click. 4 heavily armed officers boarded the aircraft instantly. Leading the pack was Deputy U.S. Marshal David Reynolds, a towering, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a face carved from granite. He wore a tactical vest bearing the bold yellow letters of the Marshals Service, his hand resting casually but firmly near his holstered sidearm. Behind him stood 3 Omaha Police Department tactical officers, their eyes scanning the cabin with cold, professional efficiency. Margaret immediately unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, blocking the aisle. She plastered a deeply relieved, victimized expression across her face, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Arthur, who remained seated with both of his hands raised empty in the air. "Officers, thank God you're here," Margaret announced loudly, her voice practically dripping with righteous authority. "I am Federal Magistrate Judge Margaret Hastings. I am the one who initiated the emergency protocol. The suspect is right here in seat 3A. He has been highly aggressive, verbally threatening, and is a clear and present danger to the safety of—" "Ma'am, sit down," Marshal Reynolds commanded. His voice was not a request. It was a low, percussive boom that instantly cut through her theatrical monologue. Margaret blinked her hand, freezing in midair. "Excuse me," she sputtered, tapping the gold badge pinned to her chest. "I am a federal judge. I declared a level 2 threat against this man. You need to remove him and his family from this aircraft immediately, so I can brief you on the assault." Marshal Reynolds did not look at Arthur. He did not look at the crying children. He kept his steely, unblinking gaze locked entirely on Margaret Hastings. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, utilizing his imposing height to physically dominate her space. "I know exactly who you are, Judge Hastings," Reynolds said, his tone utterly devoid of deference or respect. "And I know exactly what you declared. Captain Mitchell communicated directly with Federal Dispatch during the descent. We have already reviewed the preliminary crew reports." Margaret's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. "Then what are you waiting for?" "Arrest him." Stepping past Margaret, Reynolds briefly glanced at Arthur. Seeing the terrified family, the raised hands and the tears streaming down the children's faces, Reynolds's expression softened for a fraction of a second. He gave Arthur a subtle, calming nod. "You can lower your hands, sir," Reynolds said gently to Arthur. "You and your family are completely safe. Nobody is arresting you." The entire cabin inhaled a collective stunned gasp. Arthur slowly lowered his trembling hands, a wave of dizzying adrenaline-fueled relief washing over him. Anastasia buried her face in Arthur's shoulder, a choked sob escaping her lips. Marshal Reynolds pivoted back to Margaret. His eyes turned to ice. "Judge Hastings, under 49 U.S. Code, paragraph 46-504, interfering with the duties of a flight crew and falsifying a federal security threat to force an emergency diversion is a Class B felony. You are entirely out of your jurisdiction, and you are currently the primary subject of a federal investigation." Shock absolute and paralyzing washed over Margaret's face. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking starkly pale against the harsh overhead cabin lights. For a woman who had spent 2 decades wielding absolute power from the elevated sanctuary of a courtroom bench, the sensation of being publicly cornered by a superior authority was entirely alien. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing," Margaret hissed, her voice trembling no longer with feigned fear, but with genuine, unadulterated panic. "I am an articled federal judge. You do not have the authority to investigate me. This man threatened my life. He is a danger. The flight crew was too cowardly to handle him, so I had to take federal action." From the galley, Gregory, the senior purser, stepped forward. His usual deferential demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the righteous indignation of a professional who had been forced to terrify 300 passengers because of a lie. In his hand, he held a stack of hastily scribbled papers. "That is a complete fabrication." "Marshal," Gregory stated firmly, handing the papers to one of the local police officers. "These are written witness statements I collected from the surrounding passengers during the descent. The gentleman in seat 3A never raised his voice, never left his personal space, and never issued a single threat. The passenger in 2A was verbally harassing the family, using racial dog whistles, threw a glass onto the floor, and weaponized her government credentials to force me to divert the plane when I refused to relocate the family." "That's exactly right," Thomas, the young software developer in seat 4A, chimed in, loudly standing up to make his presence known. "She's completely unhinged," the guy asked her politely to stop insulting his family, and she went absolutely nuclear. She threw her own champagne glass. Other passengers began to murmur in agreement, nodding vigorously. The tide of the cabin had completely turned against her. Margaret frantically looked around, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. The insulated, privileged bubble she had lived in for her entire life had violently burst, exposing her to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. "They are lying," Margaret shrieked, her carefully cultivated composure completely shattering. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at Gregory. "You are all lying to protect a thug. I will have all of your jobs. I will subpoena every single one of you. I have friends at the Department of Justice who will strip you of your badge by nightfall, Reynolds." Marshal Reynolds didn't even flinch. He simply reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a pair of heavy stainless steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the cuffs echoed loudly in the quiet cabin, a chilling sound that made Margaret physically recoil. "Judge Hastings, your threats mean absolutely nothing to me," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, authoritative register. "You misused a federal badge to settle a petty personal grievance, forcing a commercial airliner carrying 300 people to execute an emergency diversion. You have cost this airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, endangered the safety of this flight, and committed a severe federal offense." Reynolds held out his hand, his palm flat. "Hand over your credentials. Now." Margaret stared at his open hand in absolute horror. Giving up her badge was tantamount to giving up her identity. It was her shield, her sword, and her universal hall pass. "I will do no such thing," she spat defiantly, crossing her arms over her chest. "You will have to forcibly take them from me, and I assure you the optics of you assaulting a federal judge will end your career." "I highly doubt that," a new voice interjected. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp and his expression furious. He marched down the aisle and stood next to Marshal Reynolds. "I am the commander of this aircraft. As of 10 minutes ago, I was on a direct line with the Federal Aviation Administration and the FBI field office in Omaha. The Department of Justice has already been notified of your actions, Judge. They have authorized Marshal Reynolds to detain you under suspicion of federal interference." Mitchell turned his furious gaze directly onto Margaret. "You used my airplane as a weapon to stroke your own ego. You terrified hundreds of innocent people. You owe this family," he pointed sharply toward Arthur and Anastasia, "a massive apology. But since I know you are entirely incapable of that, I will simply demand that you get off my plane." The sheer weight of the absolute rejection finally crushed Margaret. The federal marshals, the local police, the flight crew, the passengers, and the captain had formed an impenetrable wall against her. Her title meant nothing here. Her badge was a piece of useless metal. Slowly, with trembling hands that betrayed her utter defeat, Margaret unpinned the heavy gold badge from her sweater. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out her Department of Justice ID card, and dropped them both into Marshal Reynolds' awaiting palm. "Smart choice," Reynolds muttered, securing the credentials in his tactical pouch. "Now grab your bag. You're coming with us." Humiliation is a visceral, physical sensation. For Margaret Hastings, it manifested as a burning flush that crept up her neck and a sudden, violent trembling in her legs. As Marshal Reynolds and the tactical officers surrounded her, effectively boxing her in, she was forced to reach into the overhead compartment to retrieve her designer luggage. Every movement was agonizingly slow performed under the intense, unblinking scrutiny of the entire first-class cabin. "Move it along, ma'am," one of the local Omaha officers instructed bluntly, clearly entirely unimpressed by her expensive cashmere or her former title. As Margaret turned to walk down the aisle toward the exit door, she deliberately avoided making eye contact with Arthur. She kept her head down her face, entirely hidden by the curtain of her immaculate hair. Suddenly, a slow, deliberate sound broke the heavy silence. Clap. It was Thomas, the software developer. He was sitting back in his seat, clapping his hands with slow, mocking enthusiasm. Clap, clap, clap. Within seconds the sound spread. The businessman in 1B joined in. The elderly couple in row 4 started clapping. As Margaret was marched through the galley and past the heavy curtain into the main economy cabin, where 250 delayed furious passengers had just been informed of the real reason for their emergency landing, the applause erupted into a deafening roar of cheers, jeers, and loud mocking whistles. It was a brutal, overwhelming walk of shame. Passengers in the main cabin who had missed connecting flights and lost precious vacation time because of her entitlement were entirely merciless. Margaret was paraded off the aircraft, her face burning, her career and reputation completely disintegrating with every step she took down the metal boarding stairs into the freezing Nebraska rain. Back in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere drastically shifted from suffocating tension to a profound, exhausting relief. Arthur collapsed back into his plush leather seat, letting out a long, shuddering breath. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to wipe away the residual terror. Anastasia leaned over and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face against his chest. "You did so good, Arthur," she whispered fiercely, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You stayed so calm. I was so terrified." "I know, Bea, I know," Arthur murmured, kissing the top of her head while reaching over to squeeze Jackson's small knee. "It's over now." Captain Mitchell, before returning to the flight deck, crouched down in the aisle directly beside row 3. His stern, authoritative face softened significantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," Captain Mitchell said gently, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "I want to personally apologize to you and your children on behalf of the airline and myself. When a federal credential is flashed and a threat is legally declared in the air, my hands are tied by aviation law. I had to put the plane on the ground. But I knew from Gregory's report that something was incredibly wrong, which is why I bypassed local dispatch and called the federal marshals directly." Arthur looked at the captain, a deep sense of gratitude washing over him. "You didn't have to do that, Captain. You could have just let local PD board and arrest me to sort it out later. We all know how that usually goes. You took a risk for us. Thank you." Captain Mitchell shook his head firmly. "I don't tolerate bullies on my aircraft, sir, no matter what badge they carry. I promise you the rest of your flight to Honolulu will be entirely uneventful." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 golden metallic sets of pilot wings, pinning them gently onto Meyer and Jackson's shirts. "You two were incredibly brave. We'll be back in the air in about 45 minutes once we refuel." As the captain retreated to the cockpit and the flight attendants began rushing through the cabin, offering complimentary premium drinks and snacks, to apologize for the delay, Arthur looked out the window. Down on the wet tarmac, bathed in the harsh red and blue strobe lights of the police cruisers, he saw Margaret Hastings. She was standing in the pouring rain, her pristine cashmere sweater soaked her designer luggage, sitting in a puddle. Marshal Reynolds was speaking to her, sternly pointing toward the back of a marked police SUV. The doors opened, and a completely disgraced federal judge was ordered into the back seat of a squad car, stripped of her badge, her dignity, and her power. Arthur pulled down the window shade, shutting out the storm and the flashing lights. He turned back to his family. Maya was already back to reading her book, proudly wearing her pilot wings, and Jackson was giggling at a new cartoon on his iPad. The venomous shadow that had threatened to ruin their celebration had been completely eradicated. "All right, crew," Arthur said, a genuine warm smile finally breaking across his face. "Next stop, Hawaii." Anastasia smiled back, raising a fresh glass of orange juice that Chloe had just silently placed on her tray table. They clinked their plastic cups together, a quiet toast to resilience, to justice, and to the undeniable fact that sometimes the most powerful people fall the hardest when they forget how to treat others with basic human decency. The engines began to spool up again, a comforting, powerful roar that promised a return to the sky, leaving the shattered remnants of Margaret Hastings' ego far behind on the rainy Nebraska tarmac. Sunlight reflecting off the pristine turquoise waters of Waikiki Beach was a stark, beautiful contrast to the freezing Nebraska rain they had left behind. 2 days had passed since Flight 882 finally touched down at Daniel K. Inouye International Airport in Honolulu. For the Hayes family, the traumatic mid-air ordeal was rapidly dissolving into the background, replaced by the scent of plumeria and the rhythmic crashing of Pacific waves. Arthur and Anastasia sat in a private cabana at the Royal Hawaiian Resort, watching Meyer and Jackson enthusiastically build a massive sandcastle near the shoreline. They had reclaimed their peace, but half a world away, a massive, uncontainable storm had just made landfall. Margaret Hastings was not enjoying a luxury vacation. She was sitting on a rigid, stainless steel bench inside a sterile interrogation room at the United States Courthouse in downtown Omaha. She had spent the last 48 hours caught in a legal nightmare that she previously thought only applied to the defendants she mercilessly sentenced. Stripped of her jewelry, her cashmere replaced by an ill-fitting orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit, she looked haggard. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and greasy, and the arrogant fire that usually burned in her eyes had been extinguished by sheer, exhausting terror. Her high-priced defense attorney, a silver-haired shark named Richard Caldwell, walked into the interrogation room. He did not look happy. He didn't offer a reassuring smile, nor did he offer her a coffee. He simply tossed a thick manila folder onto the metal table, with a heavy, ominous thud. "I told you to call Senator Reynolds." Margaret rasped, her voice hoarse from 2 days of frantic, hysterical shouting. "I told you to call the chief judge of the appellate court. They can make this go away. I have 20 years of political capital in Washington. Use it, Richard." Caldwell pulled out a metal chair and sat down, slowly resting his elbows on the table. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of pity and intense professional frustration. "Margaret, there is no political capital left. Nobody is answering my calls. You are completely, incredibly radioactive. Senator Reynolds' office issued a public statement an hour ago, entirely distancing themselves from you." Margaret's jaw dropped. "That's impossible. Why would they do that before the trial? It's just my word against a commercial flight crew. I am a federal magistrate." "Because it is not just your word against a flight crew," Caldwell said grimly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and slid it across the metal table toward her. "You didn't just anger the flight crew, Margaret. You angered row 4. On the screen, a video was playing. It wasn't a shaky, unclear video. It was a crisp, high-definition recording, taken by Thomas, the young software developer who had been sitting in seat 4A. Thomas wasn't just a random passenger. He was Thomas Arrington, the highly influential CEO of a prominent Chicago tech startup, and he had an audience of 3 million followers on the platform formerly known as Twitter. The video captured everything. It started right before Margaret threw her champagne glass. It captured Arthur's calm, impeccably professional voice, asking her to stop insulting his family. It vividly captured Margaret's unhinged racist tirade, her weaponization of the term ghetto, and the exact moment she shoved her federal badge in the purser's face, demanding an emergency diversion based on a completely fabricated threat. It even included the audio of Captain Mitchell publicly reprimanding her before having her dragged off the plane by Marshal Reynolds. Arrington posted this yesterday morning, Caldwell explained, his voice flat. He titled it, "When First-Class Privilege Commits a Federal Felony." It currently has 45 million views. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and the New York Times are running it on a continuous loop. The hashtag #FirstClass Magistrate is trending #1 globally. Margaret stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and rapid. She watched herself lie. She watched herself abuse her power, seeing it from an outside perspective, stripped of her internal justifications. It was horrifying. The undeniable recorded truth was staring her right in the face. "It gets substantially worse," Caldwell continued, not giving her a moment to recover. "Because the video definitively proves you were acting outside the scope of your judicial duties, engaging in a personal, malicious attack. You have forfeited your absolute judicial immunity. The Department of Justice is terrified of the optics. They threw you under the bus. The Attorney General officially authorized the Class B felony charges under 49 U.S. Code, Portbara 464504. You are looking at a minimum of 10 years in federal prison for interfering with a flight crew and falsifying a federal threat." Margaret slumped forward, burying her face in her trembling hands. A strangled, pathetic sob echoed in the cold room. The impenetrable fortress of her privilege had been completely dismantled by a 30-second smartphone clip. "And Arthur Hayes," Caldwell added, twisting the knife just a little further. "He isn't just an architect. He is a senior partner at one of the wealthiest firms in the Midwest. His firm's legal department has retained Jonathan Pierce, the most aggressive civil rights litigator in Chicago. They are filing a massive civil lawsuit against you personally for severe emotional distress defamation and civil rights violations. They are going after your pension, your properties, and your savings, Margaret. The Judicial Conduct Board convened an emergency session this morning. They are drafting your articles of impeachment, but they strongly suggest you resign by midnight to save the federal courts the embarrassment." It was an absolute, categorical destruction. Margaret Hastings, a woman who had spent decades looking down on the world, was finally being crushed by the immense weight of the justice system she had so casually weaponized. She had no friends, no badge, and no power left. Thousands of miles away, the sun was beginning its slow descent over the Pacific Ocean, painting the Hawaiian sky in breathtaking shades of violent orange and deep purple. Arthur and Anastasia were sitting on the balcony of their suite, the ocean breeze gently rustling the palm trees outside. Jackson and Maya were fast asleep, inside completely exhausted from a full day of swimming and exploring. Arthur's phone buzzed on the glass patio table. He glanced at the caller ID, recognizing the number of Jonathan Pierce, his newly retained attorney. Arthur answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so Anastasia could hear. "Good evening, Arthur." Jonathan's confident, energetic voice crackled through the speaker. "I hope the weather in Honolulu is treating you well." "It's practically paradise, Jonathan," Arthur replied, reaching over to take Anastasia's hand. "Do you have an update for us?" "I have the best possible update," Jonathan said warmly. Margaret Hastings officially submitted her irrevocable letter of resignation to the federal bench 10 minutes ago. She surrendered her law license to avoid a public disbarment hearing. Furthermore, her defense team just reached out to me. They want to settle the civil suit out of court. They are offering an incredibly substantial sum, effectively draining her remaining assets to avoid a public trial. Anastasia let out a long, shuddering breath, a tear of absolute relief rolling down her cheek. "Is she going to prison, Jonathan?" she asked quietly. The federal prosecutor in Omaha is not backing down, Jonathan confirmed. With the video evidence and the pilot's testimony, she will be taking a plea deal that guarantees significant federal prison time. She will never hold a position of authority over another human being for the rest of her life. You stopped her, Arthur. You stood your ground, you protected your family, and you exposed a corrupt official. You won. Arthur looked out at the vast, darkening ocean. He thought about the terrifying moment the plane banked toward Nebraska, the suffocating fear of the heavily armed police boarding the cabin, and the systemic terror that people like Margaret Hastings relied upon to maintain their unearned dominance. But then he looked at his wife, smiling beautifully in the tropical twilight, and he listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of his children, sleeping safely in the next room. "No, Jonathan," Arthur said softly, a deep, resonant peace settling perfectly into his soul. "We didn't just win, we survived, and we're going to make sure she never forgets that." Arthur hung up the phone and set it face down on the table, entirely disconnecting from the drama, the lawsuits, and the shattered legacy of Margaret Hastings. He raised his glass of sparkling water, clinking it gently against Anastasia's glass as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the Hawaiian horizon. The storm was finally permanently over. What a breathtaking collapse of an empire! Margaret Hastings genuinely believed her shiny gold badge made her invincible, but she entirely forgot that true power lies in dignity, integrity, and the undeniable truth of a viral video. If you loved watching this arrogant judge face the absolute reality of her own actions, smash that like button right now. Share this story to remind everyone that nobody is above the law, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more deeply satisfying, true-to-life stories of instant karma. Drop a comment below. Do you think 10 years in federal prison is enough? Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.